The scent of Joe Malone lime and basil wafted through the Thorne penthouse, a scent Elara had meticulously chosen to brand Julian's home for the evening. She smoothed a stray wrinkle on the linen tablecloth, her fingers lingering on the place cards she'd hand calligraphied. For 5 years, Elara Vance had been the silent scaffolding holding up the monument that was Julian Thorne. She was the one who translated his aggressive business instincts into elegant prose for his pitches. She was the one who remembered his mother's birthday and the specific vintage of scotch his biggest investors preferred. Tonight was Julian's 31st birthday, and the air felt thick with more than just expensive catering. "Elara, where's the spreadsheet for the Landon merger?" Julian's voice boomed from the bedroom. He stepped out, struggling with a set of diamond cufflinks she'd bought him 3 months ago. "In your encrypted drive, under Project Phoenix, Julian," she said, walking over to him. She didn't wait for him to ask. She simply took his wrists and expertly fastened the links. "I also highlighted the tax loopholes in yellow. You should mention them during the toast tonight. It'll make you look more detail-oriented than the auditors." Julian didn't look at her face. He looked at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window. He adjusted his jaw, admiring the sharp silhouette of his designer suit. "Perfect. You're a lifesaver, Al." He patted her cheek, a gesture one might give a golden retriever, and headed toward the bar. Elara felt a small, nervous flutter in her chest. Tonight felt different. He'd been talking about the next phase of his life for weeks. In the drawer of her bedside table, she had a small, velvet-lined space waiting for a ring she was certain would appear tonight. The party was a blur of clinking crystal and predatory laughter. Elara moved through the crowd like a ghost, refilling drinks before they were empty and steering Julian away from guests who drank too much. She was exhausted, her feet aching in 5-inch stilettos, but she kept a practiced smile on her face. Around midnight, she went to the kitchen to check on the dessert service. To get there, she had to pass the glass-walled cigar lounge. Through the heavy door, she heard Julian's distinctive booming laugh. "Come on, Julian," a voice teased. Mark, one of his venture capitalist buddies. "Come on, Julian. When are you going to put a ring on it? She's basically your shadow." Elara froze, her hand inches from the door handle. "Elara," Julian's voice was smooth, devoid of the warmth he usually reserved for her in private. "She's a great girl, Mark. Reliable, like a favorite old sweater you wear around the house because it's comfortable and knows your shape." A chorus of chuckles erupted. "But you don't wear an old sweater to a gala at the Met," Julian continued, his tone turning clinical. "I'm moving into the stratosphere now. The waterfront project is going to make me a billionaire. To get there, I need a partner who commands the room, not someone who hides in the corner managing the guest list. You need a silk gown for the red carpet, not wool. Honestly, I've outgrown her. I'm just waiting for the right moment to let her down easy." The world seemed to tilt. Elara felt a coldness wash over her that had nothing to do with the Chicago winter outside. The invisible labor she'd provided wasn't seen as a partnership. It was seen as a service that had reached its expiration date. She didn't burst in. She didn't scream. She walked back to the bedroom, her movements precise and robotic. She grabbed her laptop bag and the carrier for Barnaby, her ginger tabby. She didn't pack her clothes. Most of them had been bought to match Julian's aesthetic anyway. She met him in the hallway as the last of the guests were trickling out. Julian looked flushed with success, a glass of 30-year-old Macallan in his hand. "There you are," he said, eyeing her bag. "Going somewhere? I thought we'd celebrate after everyone left." "I heard you in the lounge, Julian." Her voice was terrifyingly calm. Julian's expression shifted from confusion to a brief flash of guilt, then settled into a mask of arrogant pragmatism. He set his glass down. "Look, Elara, I was going to talk to you tomorrow. You're a smart girl. You had to know we've been drifting. Our lives are moving at different speeds." He reached into his inner breast pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. He slid it across the marble console table. It was a check. This should cover a deposit on a nice place and then some. Consider it a severance or a parting gift. I want you to be taken care of. Elara looked at the check. The amount was more than her annual salary as an associate architect. She looked at Julian, really looked at him, and saw the hollowness behind the expensive suit. She didn't take the check. "You're right about one thing, Julian," she said, picking up Barnaby's carrier. "You do need something new, but it's not a silk gown, it's a calculator. Because without me to do your math and write your scripts, you're just a loud man in a loud room." "Elara, don't be dramatic," he scoffed, though his eyes narrowed. "You'll be calling me by Tuesday when you realize how expensive the real world is." "Good luck with the waterfront project," she said, her hand on the door. "I hear the design requirements are quite rigorous. I hope your new partner knows how to read a blueprint." She walked out without looking back. As the elevator doors hissed shut, Elara didn't cry. Instead, she opened her laptop. She had an unread email from the city planning board. Invitation to submit. Anonymous design competition for the Chicago waterfront. She deleted the bookmark for Julian's calendar and began to type. The radiator in Elara's new studio apartment hissed like a grumpy snake, a sharp contrast to the silent, climate-controlled perfection of Julian's penthouse. The space was barely 400 square feet, located in a brick walk-up in Wicker Park. It smelled of old wood and the citrus cleaner she'd used to scrub the floor until her hands were raw. Barnaby sat on the windowsill, his tail twitching as he watched the Chicago L train rattle past. "It's not a palace, Barnaby," Elara whispered, clicking her laptop open, "but at least the air belongs to us." The first week was the hardest. Her thumb would hover over her phone at 7 a.m., ready to text Julian's assistant about his dry cleaning, or her brain would automatically start drafting a rebuttal for a meeting she was no longer invited to. She felt like a phantom limb, still twitching with the ghost of a life she'd been cut from. She looked at her reflection in the small bathroom mirror. Her hair was pulled back in the same tight, efficient bun Julian liked. Her clothes were a sea of neutral beige and gray, designed to blend into the background of his success. With a pair of kitchen shears and a trembling hand, she snipped the hair tie. Then she cut. Not a dramatic, cinematic chop, but enough to lose the corporate assistant look. She let her natural curls breathe for the first time in years. She traded the beige for a thrifted, oversized velvet blazer and a deep, defiant navy. She wasn't just changing her clothes, she was excavating her soul. The anonymous design competition for the waterfront was her lifeline. The brief called for a synthesis of commerce and community. Julian, she knew, would be pushing for high-end luxury retail, monolithic glass towers that screamed wealth. Elara sat at her cramped desk, the city skyline glowing in the distance. She didn't think about what Julian wanted. She thought about what she loved about Chicago. The hidden pockets of greenery, the way light hit the lake at dusk, the necessity of shelter that felt like a hug, not a fortress. She began to draw. The lines were fluid, daring, and structurally brilliant. She signed the digital file with a pseudonym, the Architect of Echoes. 2 weeks later, needing to network but fearing the pity looks of her old circle, Elara attended a small gallery opening for a local sculptor. She stayed near the back, a glass of cheap red wine in her hand. "That's a bold choice," a voice rumbled beside her. She turned. The man was tall, with a ruggedness that suggested he spent as much time on construction sites as he did in boardrooms. His suit wasn't a designer label, it was well worn and fit him perfectly. Silas Vane. She recognized him instantly, the wolf of the West Side, a developer known for being Julian's primary rival. The wine? It's terrible, Elara said, her voice steadier than she felt. I meant the blazer, Silas said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He didn't look at her like she was a utility. He looked at her like she was a puzzle. And your interest in that sculpture. Most people are looking at the price tag. You're looking at the weight distribution. Elara blinked. It's top-heavy. If the humidity in here rises 5%, the bronze will warp the cedar base. Silas leaned back, impressed. You have a sharp eye. Have we met? You look familiar, but the energy is different. I used to be a ghost, Elara said. A ghost with a degree from IIT and a penchant for urban flow? Silas asked, his tone dropping the playfulness for something sharper. I remember your thesis, Elara Vance. It was the most innovative thing I'd read in a decade. Then you disappeared. You became Thorne's shadow. I always wondered why a Ferrari would choose to stay parked in a garage. The bluntness of his words stung, but it was the kind of sting that woke up a sleeping limb. The garage door is open now, Elara said. Good, Silas replied. He handed her a card. It was thick, matte black. I'm bidding on the waterfront project. My firm is looking for a lead architect who isn't afraid to break a few windows. If you're tired of haunting other people's buildings, call me. As Silas walked away, Elara's phone buzzed in her pocket. Julian, 8:13 p.m. I can't find the login for the offshore account, and the caterer for the gala is asking about the floral arrangements. I suppose you're enjoying this little tantrum, but it's getting expensive. Come home, Elle. I'll double the check. Elara looked at the screen. She felt a flicker of the old, reliable sweater urge, the need to fix things, to make his life smooth. Then she looked at Silas's card, then at her own sketches on her laptop. She didn't reply. She blocked his number. The next morning, the news broke. The Chicago Waterfront Project, 5 finalists announced. Number 1 was Thorne Capital. Number 5 was the Architect of Echoes. Julian Thorne had the money, but for the first time in his life, he was competing against the one person who knew exactly how he thought and exactly where his weaknesses were hidden.
The Chicago Cultural Center was a cathedral of glass and mahogany, bathed in the amber glow of 1,000 Edison bulbs. Tonight, the air didn't just smell of expensive perfume and floral arrangements, it smelled of ambition. The shortlist gala for the waterfront project was the city's most coveted invitation, and for the first time in 5 years, Elara wasn't carrying Julian's coat or checking his teeth for spinach. She stood near the grand staircase, smoothing the fabric of a vintage midnight blue silk slip dress. Over it, she wore the structured navy velvet blazer Silas had admired. It was a look that said she was both the artist and the executive. Her hair, once a restrained bun, now tumbled in dark, defiant waves around her face. "You look like you're about to start a revolution," a low voice said behind her. Elara turned to find Silas Vane. He looked effortless in a charcoal suit, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. He wasn't looking at the crowd, he was looking at her with a quiet, steady intensity. "I'm just here to see the work," Elara said, her heart hammering a rhythmic beat against her ribs. "Liars don't design buildings that look like poems, Elara," Silas countered softly. "I saw your submitted renders for The Architect of Echoes. The way you used the light wells to draw people toward the water, it's genius. Thorne's proposal, on the other hand, is a series of glass boxes. It has all the soul of a spreadsheet. He'll have the biggest lobby, though," Elara noted, glancing across the room.
There he was, Julian Thorne. He was surrounded by a phalanx of investors, looking every bit the victor, but as Elara watched, she noticed the cracks. His tie was slightly crooked, a detail Elara would have fixed in seconds. He was checking his watch every 2 minutes, and the woman on his arm, a blonde model type in a dress so tight she looked uncomfortable, was scrolling on her phone, clearly bored. Julian's eyes scanned the room, landing on Elara. He froze. He did a double take, his gaze traveling from her curls down to her heels. He whispered something to his companion and began cutting through the crowd like a shark through water. Silas stepped back slightly, giving Elara space, but his presence remained a warm weight at her shoulder. The wolf is hungry. Don't let him bite. Elara? Julian reached her, his voice a mix of shock and a strange, possessive relief. God, I barely recognized you. What did you do to your hair? I let it grow, Julian, she said, her voice cool and level. How is the project coming along? I hear you've had some logistical hurdles. Julian's jaw tightened. Minor setbacks. My new firm is still finding its rhythm. The assistant I hired is a disaster. She can't even format a basic CAD file. He took a step closer, lowering his voice, trying to reclaim the intimacy they once had. Look, Elle, I was hard on you. The birthday, it was a lot of pressure. I've missed your input. These investors, they're asking questions I used to have the answers for. Why don't we grab a drink after this, just us? We can talk about your sabbatical being over. Elara felt a sudden, sharp clarity. He wasn't apologizing because he missed her. He was apologizing because he missed his manual. I'm not on a sabbatical, Julian. I'm on a career path. Before he could respond, the chime of a crystal glass rang out. The head of the city planning board, Evelyn Reed, stood on the podium. Thank you all for coming. The waterfront project is the future of Chicago. We have narrowed our vision down to 2 frontrunners. Their identities remain anonymous to the board for final voting, but tonight we showcase the heart of their designs. 2 massive screens flickered to life. On the left, Thorne Capital's The Diamond District. It was a wall of cold, reflective glass, luxury condos and high-end boutiques. It was Julian's ego in architectural form. On the right, the architect of Echoes, The Living Shore. It was a sprawling, tiered park system integrated into a library and a community center, using sustainable materials that looked as if they had grown out of the lake itself. It was breathtaking. It was human. The room went silent, then erupted into hushed whispers. Julian's face went from pale to a mottled, angry red. He stared at the right screen, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the curvature of the arches, a signature style Elara used to doodle in the margins of his notebooks. He turned to Elara, his voice a low hiss. Is this you? You're the architect of Echoes? I'm a finalist, Julian, and unlike the old sweater, this design is going to be seen by the whole world. You think you can beat me? Julian scoffed, though his hand was trembling as he gripped his champagne flute. She has the better design, Silas interrupted, stepping forward, and as of 4 o'clock today, she has the backing of Vane Development. If she wins the board's vote, I'm providing the capital, full autonomy, her name on the cornerstone. Julian looked between them, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The utility he had discarded was now the biggest threat to his empire. You're making a mistake, Elara, Julian said, his voice dropping to a desperate growl. You don't know how to play this game. I don't need to play the game, Julian, Elara said, turning her back on him to look at the screen. I designed the board. Later that night, back in her quiet studio, Elara's phone lit up. Julian, 11:45 p.m., I'm outside. We need to talk. I know I messed up. The waterfront project is nothing without your touch. I'll give you a partnership, 50-50. Just come down and let's fix this, please. Elara looked at the message. She thought about the 5 years she'd spent making him look brilliant while she stayed in the shadows. She thought about the parting gift check he'd tried to pay her off with. She didn't reply. She didn't even block him this time. She simply left him on read, the 2 blue checks a silent testament to her indifference. She went to her desk and picked up her pencil. She had a final presentation to perfect, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't building a pedestal for someone else. She was building a foundation for herself. The morning of the final selection was gray. The Chicago sky a heavy sheet of slate that promised a storm. Inside the city planning board's inner sanctum, the atmosphere was even colder. The room was a sterile box of glass and steel, dominated by a long mahogany cable where the 6 directors sat like high priests of urban fate. Elara waited in the antechamber, her fingers steady as she adjusted her tablet. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal wool, sharp, professional, and entirely her own. The door opened and Julian Thorne stepped out. He looked haggard. The charismatic mask was slipping, his eyes were bloodshot, and he'd developed a nervous habit of adjusting his cufflinks every few seconds. When he saw Elara, he didn't sneer. He lunged toward her, his voice a frantic whisper. "Elara, wait, I saw your updated projections. You're using the natural aquifer system to manage the runoff." He looked at her with a mix of awe and terror. "My entire proposal relies on the concrete seawall. If the board sees your cost efficiency on environmental impact, my investors will pull out before the sun sets. They're already spooked by the Landon merger leaks." He reached for her hand, his palm damp. "I'm offering you a seat on the board of Thorne Capital, not as an assistant, as a partner. We can merge the bids right now. I'll tell them we've been working together all along. It's the only way to save the project, Elara. Our project." Elara gently pulled her hand away. "It was never our project, Julian. It was your monument and my labor. And you're right about one thing. It doesn't need saving. It just needs the right architect." "Miss Vance, the board is ready," the secretary announced. Elara walked past him without a second glance. Inside, the presentation was a masterclass. Elara didn't just show blueprints, she showed a vision of a city that breathed. She revealed how Julian's proposed diamond district would actually cause long-term erosion to the neighboring piers, a flaw her design corrected by working with the water rather than against it. She showed how her partnership with Vane Development ensured the community spaces would be privately funded but publicly accessible. When she finished, there was a profound silence. Then Evelyn Reed leaned forward. "Miss Vance, this is the most sophisticated structural integration we've seen in 20 years. It renders the traditional luxury tower model obsolete." 2 hours later, the decision was leaked. Vane Development and the architect of Echoes had won the contract. Thorne Capital was out. Elara walked out of the building and into the pouring rain. She didn't mind the water. It felt like a baptism. She was halfway to her car when a shadow blocked her path. Julian was drenched, his $1,000 suit ruined and clinging to his frame. He looked smaller than she remembered. "I lost everything today," his voice cracking against the roar of the rain. "The board, the investors, they're calling in my loans. They think I'm a fraud because I couldn't answer their technical questions." He took a step toward her, his face contorting into a look of raw, pathetic desperation. He fell to one knee, the splash of the puddle soaking his trousers. "Elara, please, I'm begging you, talk to Silas. Tell him you need me on the management side. You know I can sell anything. I'll do anything. I'll marry you tonight. We can go to the courthouse. I'll give you the life you wanted. Just don't leave me like this. Don't let me drown." Elara looked down at the man she had once thought was the center of her universe. She felt no spike of joy at his misery, no surge of vengeful heat. She felt only a profound, quiet pity. "You're still not listening, Julian," she said, her voice easily rising above the storm. "You're offering me a marriage proposal as a business transaction to save your reputation. You didn't want a partner. You wanted an architect for your ego. You wanted someone to build your world while you sat on the throne." She took a breath of the cold, wet air. "I finally started building my own life, and I realized I don't have room for a ruin like you. You aren't a silk gown or an old sweater, Julian. You're just a man who forgot that a building is only as strong as its foundation, and yours was built on sand." She turned and walked to her car. In the rearview mirror, she saw him, a solitary, dark figure, kneeling in the rain, surrounded by the towering skyscrapers he no longer owned. 6 months later. The morning sun flooded the corner office of Vance and Vane. The space was filled with the scent of fresh blueprints and roasted coffee. On the frosted glass of the door, the gold lettering was dry: Elara Vance, lead architect. Elara stood by the window, looking out at the waterfront. The cranes were already up, the first skeletal ribs of the living shore rising against the blue of Lake Michigan. The door opened, and Julian walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit. He had his sleeves rolled up, a smudge of charcoal on his thumb. He set 2 coffees on her desk, black for him, a splash of oat milk for her, just the way she liked it. "The structural team just signed off on the atrium," Silas said. "They said it shouldn't work, but the math is perfect." "The math is always perfect," Elara said with a small, confident smile. He looked at her, his expression softening with a respect that had nothing to do with utility and everything to do with the woman she had become. "What's next on the agenda, boss?" Silas asked, leaning against the desk. Elara picked up her coffee and looked back at the horizon. She wasn't Julian's shadow, and she wasn't Silas's prize. She was the woman who had designed the skyline she was looking at. "Next," Elara said, her voice steady and bright, "we build something that lasts." The Chicago wind wasn't biting today. It was a brisk, cheering gale that carried the scent of Lake Michigan and fresh cedar. A massive white canopy had been erected over the north plaza of the living shore. Hundreds of people, reporters, city officials, and ordinary citizens, milled about the tiered gardens and the winding wooden walkways that seemed to float just inches above the water. Elara stood in the wings of the temporary stage, her fingers tracing the edge of a silver pair of scissors. She wore a tailored suit of emerald silk, a color that vibrated with life against the blue of the horizon. She wasn't hiding behind a clipboard or a man's ego today. She was the guest of honor. Nervous? She didn't have to turn to know it was Silas. He smelled of sandalwood and the espresso he'd just handed her. He looked out at the project, his eyes reflecting the sunlight bouncing off the sustainable glass of the new community library. "A little," Elara admitted, taking a sip. 5 years ago, I was ghostwriting Julian's speech for a ribbon cutting just like this. I stayed in the car because he didn't want my associate energy to distract the investors." Silas moved closer, his shoulder brushing hers. "Look at them, Elara. They aren't looking for an associate. They're looking for the woman who gave the city its soul back." Evelyn Reed, the planning board chair, stepped to the microphone, her voice projected over the cheering crowd. "Today, we don't just open a park. We open a dialogue between the city and the lake. This masterpiece was born from the vision of a woman who refused to stay in the shadows." As Elara walked onto the stage, the applause was a physical wave. She looked out at the crowd, and for a fleeting second, her gaze caught a figure at the very edge of the pier, beyond the security cordons. It was Julian. He looked unremarkable in the crowd. He wasn't wearing a designer suit anymore. He wore a plain, dark windbreaker, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wasn't the venture capitalist of the year or the Prince of Chicago anymore. He was just a man standing on a sidewalk, looking at a world he had no part in. Through the distance, their eyes met for a heartbeat. There was no anger in Elara's heart, only a cold, crystalline clarity. She saw him realize that the silk gown he'd been looking for wasn't a person he could buy. It was the greatness he had tried to suppress in her. He looked at the library, the park, and the woman on the stage, and he looked smaller than the smallest pebble on the shore. Elara turned away from him, focusing back on the crowd. Architecture is often about height, how high we can build, how much we can dominate the skyline, but the living shore was built on a different principle, depth. It's about how deep the foundations go and how much room we leave for others to grow alongside us. She took the scissors and, with Silas and Evelyn by her side, sliced through the thick blue ribbon. The crowd erupted. Children immediately ran toward the water play area. Elderly couples began to stroll along the sculpture garden. The building wasn't a monument to her, it was a gift to the city. An hour later, as the reception began to wind down, Silas found her sitting on a stone bench at the water's edge, her heels kicked off. "The critics are calling it the Vance effect," Silas said, sitting down beside her. Elara leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the sun begin its slow descent, turning the lake into a sheet of hammered gold. "I didn't want to change the city, Silas. I just wanted to stop being an old sweater." Silas laughed softly, his hand finding hers. His grip was firm, a partnership based on equal strength. "You were never a sweater, Elara. You were the blueprint. Everyone else was just lucky to live in the house you built." "What's next?" Silas asked, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Elara looked out at the horizon, at the endless possibilities of the blue water. She thought about the tiny studio, the gray nights of Act 2, and the long road to her own name. "Next," she said, a brilliant, unshakable smile lighting up her face, "we take the world." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lights of the living shore flickered on, glowing like a diamond in the dark, not because someone had polished it, but because it was finally, brilliantly, clear.